The final 15 minutes we've set aside for audience questions, and we'll look forward to hearing from each of you then. I'm Emily Parlapiano, Head of Programs and Partnerships at CECP's CEO Investor Forum, and I will be moderating today's quick session. But before we get started, I just wanted to thank you for your patience as we've attempted to use a new event platform. We were really hopeful that all would go smoothly, but we do apologize that we've now had to move back over to Zoom. So thank you for your patience there and understanding. As many of you know, the CEO Investor Forum is the capital markets arm of Chief Executives for Corporate Purpose. Our team was founded on the belief that in order to really drive impact, CEOs and investors must jointly commit to changing how success is measured in the capital markets. And the ultimate goal from our team's perspective really is to move from a focus on short-term measures of success to an emphasis on long-term value creation. And at the CEO Investor Forum, we are working with cross-functional teams and leaders from sustainability to investor relations by offering advisory services, year-round events, CEO engagement opportunities, and proprietary research to our members as well. So with me today are my colleagues, Nandika Madgavkar, our team leader who heads up the CEO Investor Forum, David Yee, who leads on CEO engagement, and Alexa Yiğit, who is head of sustainable finance. But before kicking off with our top trends of 2020, I thought it would be good to take a quick step back and just briefly reflect. You know, this has been a really challenging year, and it's not over yet. It's been a year of hardship and of change, and it's also been a really great year for momentum. We've seen an explosion of interest in sustainability and ESG. We've seen a rise of corporate commitments to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'm really hopeful that 2021 will be a momentous year for both social and environmental impact. So with that, let's jump in. Jess, we can head to the next slide. The first trend that we're going to be talking about today is collaboration and consolidation. So what did we see this year? We saw ESG go mainstream with investors. They were incorporating environmental, social, and governance factors to support their investment decisions at an unprecedented rate. We saw the growth of ESG-specific products, with institutional investors now beginning to really think of ESG as integral to meeting their fiduciary responsibilities. And with all of that came an increase from the investment community calling for a demand for quality, consistent, and comparable data from the market, really proving that data is clean when it comes to ESG. Another thing we saw this year began with small ESG data and research firms standing tall. And by the end of the year, consolidation in this space has certainly set in. We've seen major acquisitions from some of the largest market data providers, including the likes of Morningstar, who completed its acquisition of Sustainalytics this year, and also S&P Global's acquisition of the ESG ratings business from Rebecca Osam. We saw increased collaboration within leading ESG frameworks and metrics. Some examples there, SASB and GRI announced a collaborative work plan. SASB also merged most recently with the IIRC, creating the Value Reporting Foundation. And the World Economic Forum's work with the IBC and the Big Four accounting firms to define core metrics happened this year as well. So in 2021, I expect we'll continue towards more rounded and uniform and transparent ESG data. The existing standards and frameworks providers will likely move towards universality, and M&A will likely continue across sectors until the aggregate confusion that we've all been experiencing has diminished to, I'd say, a lighter noise. So with that, Nandika, I'll pass it over to you.
unmuting myself. Thank you, Emily. Jess, if we can just move on to the next slide, please. So, just from where we sit at the Chief Executives of Corporate Purpose and the work we do with our affiliated companies, we are 200 strong, 200 plus in this organization. There are some key trends that we've noticed over the last, over this year. And obviously, as Emily pointed out, and as we all know, the pandemic and then the murder of George Floyd really kind of set the stage for how companies started reacting and innovating and thinking about corporate responsibility and the broader framework of ESG as they think about their business strategy. So clearly we saw the S in ESG take the driver's seat. It wasn't that companies were not focused on the S. They have always been. It just took higher prominence. And one of the things that we've noticed sort of in the work we do is that while there are very clear measures and metrics around the E, and there's some around G, but the S, the metrics and the measurements around S were not as strong as we would like it to be. So, we've seen a growing trend towards the focus on the S in terms of measurement. We've seen an increased demand for transparency from all stakeholders, not just shareholders and investors, but employees, the public, people wanting to know how businesses are going to step up, especially in a world where we've seen that there was a lack of potentially a focus from government and public policy. And we see that also reflected in the Edelman Trust Barometer's results that were recently shared through the Edelman organization. We've seen in the work that we do at the CEO Investor Forum a breakdown in the silo between corporate responsibility and investor relations. And this is kind of comes back to the stakeholder voice and the stakeholder activism, which is making companies actually bring business units to the table as they start to build their narrative around what is the purpose of the company, how are they going to lead for the future. And that breakdown of silos has been one of the key, I would say the key focus area for our team as we've kind of helped companies put together their long-term plan. And of course, adaptability and innovation, we've seen that across the spectrum, whether it's remote work, whether it's the way we think about policies and practices as it relates to employees. And resiliency, I think that is the word of the year. Companies have innovated, employees and all of us in our day-to-day work, as well as in our personal lives, have shown a resiliency in dealing with a very unprecedented year, 2020. Just the next slide, please. So what can we expect in 2021? I think one of the things we've seen is that purpose has become the North Star, and companies are truly doubling down, not just paying lip service to corporate purpose, but making sure that it aligns with their social issues. Our most recent research paper, The Return on Purpose, which you can find on our website, ceoinvestorforum.com, reflects on the value, particularly that CEOs are putting on corporate purpose as a strategic differentiator. There is going to be a continued focus on employee well-being, health, and safety. The CEO Investor Forum and CECP has been doing a lot of work with partners in this space, setting ourselves up for what 2021 will bring. There are questions around vaccinations. How do we incentivize employees to get vaccinated to come back to the workforce? How do we continue to ensure that frontline workers and essential workers are protected and there's enough PPE and safety measures in place? So there's going to be a lot of conversation around employee well-being, and not to forget the mental health aspect of what we are going to probably see coming out in 2021. We are seeing increased collaboration across business units as companies set their context and own their narrative, and that is exactly where the CEO Investor Forum partners with companies at CECP to help companies really craft that narrative. Because companies are doing a lot of good work and a lot of great work, actually. But how are they telling their stories to the markets so that the markets can appreciate and hopefully invest in companies for the long term? And then, having a voice. Like if we don't have a point of view, it's not good enough anymore. So brands have to take a stand, and we are seeing a lot of our companies step up to do that. And finally, regulation, whether it is regulation around forward-looking metrics required from companies, or whether it is regulation around defining what diversity looks like within companies, we are going to see a lot of that come up in 2021. And last but not least, and then I'm going to hand it over to Alexa because she's going to speak to this, I think climate is going to come back on the agenda in a big way. With the Biden administration, it's something we are going to see a refocusing on, and I think that's what we need. We are going to be talking about. And my apologies, we are going to pivot and we're going to talk about our CEO point of view first, and then we are going to speak about everything else that is happening in the sustainable finance space. David.
Thanks, Nandika. Yeah, so I think, from a CEO standpoint, it's pretty needless to say that CEOs were really forced to throw out their game plan early in 2020 within the first few months. And quite ominously, early in 2020, we had our Board of Boards, which is our flagship CEO-only event in New York City, typically in person, where the Detroit utility company former CEO of DT Energy spoke about how he led the company through the 2008 financial crisis. Looking back to February now, that's kind of a strange thing for him to be talking about. And then in the next month, the country is kind of shut down. But, he spoke about how he led the company through refraining from laying off people and subsequently using purpose and the company's values throughout that time after the financial crisis to subsequently outperform the market in the coming years. So he spoke about how he did this through building trust consistently, communicating with the employees and ensuring them that, they were in this together as a company. This wasn't focused on the share price. This wasn't focused on, making money for everybody else but the employees, but it was really focused on building a culture and building a community within their employees to survive for the long term. So thinking about that throughout everything this year, COVID, racial injustices, preserving people's health, and overall employee well-being, CEOs were really forced to communicate. And that's a large trend we saw this year was the different ways they communicated. CEOs are used to talking on quarterly calls and to their investors, but, we saw them talking through video message to their employees, all staff meetings, all staff emails, Q&A sessions, small town halls with their employees. And CEOs really embrace these new ways of talking to their employees to build trust, to lead them through the uncertainty and make sure they knew that leadership was with them. They understood, they empathized with what they were going through, and try to build it for the long term and make sure that, you're building morale throughout the company in these uncertain times. So, these are communication is something we saw in our CEO roundtables that we piloted in the spring and that we've been continuing throughout this year and throughout 2021. We have a good lineup of CEO speakers, but CEOs have been really open about how they've just been having difficult conversations with employees around race, around uncertainty of employees' jobs. And like I said, they're used to talking to investors about the quarterly earnings and things like that. But these more intimate conversations are new, and I expect them to continue for 2021. And along with this communication is advocacy, the way they communicate more broadly and more publicly. It's been a trend that's been growing each year, so it's not necessarily a new trend, but it's becoming ever more prominent. Not only are CEOs speaking publicly on certain issues and releasing statements like racial injustice that we saw this summer, but it's also an expectation by employees of their executive leaders. Employees are expecting their CEOs and executives to be vocal advocates on these types of issues. So in 2021, much like 2020, I'm hesitant to make any predictions going into it in case things get turned upside down again. But I think CEOs are going to double down on the progress that they made for employees being in crisis mode in 2020. So that's all aspects of human capital, whether it's, as Nandika mentioned, advancing DEI efforts as a growth opportunity, honing in on their safety, especially for frontline workers, and then building and maintaining culture as office environments shift from how we traditionally know them to a larger presence of remote work. On a recent CEO roundtable, we spoke to CEOs, and Deanna Mulligan has a great book that was recently released on higher purpose, HIRE purpose. And it's about the future of work and reskilling and upskilling employees. And a lot of the CEOs on the call were discussing the future of the office space, what that would look like. They see benefits of remote work, but they also see benefits of being in the office. Those impromptu conversations help build relationships. They help build innovation, bring new ideas to the company. So they're trying to find a really a way that we can have a mix of both remote work and in person, but also that way it's equitable for everybody. And lastly, overall, a lot of changes CEOs made this year out of necessity. Like I said, it was crisis mode for many companies, but what they're going to have to do in 2021 is be very meticulous about what changes are sustainable for the business in the future. What changes were they made this year that might not have been great decisions. They might have been great for a pandemic situation where everyone's working remotely full time, but will that sustain them in 2021 when people start to move back to the office? How are we rethinking these different ideas? And so it's a matter of keeping those good ideas to build long-term sustainable value, and then leaving everything else in 2020. And now I'll pass it over to Alexa.
Thanks, David. And being conscious of the time, buckle up, we're going to go fast. So if we could go to the next slide. Great, thank you, Jess. So it's no surprise this year, 2020, more than ever, as some of my colleagues mentioned, we're really getting a sense of this active stakeholder engagement. And that's what leads to the concept of stakeholder capitalism. I like to think that this kind of stemmed from early conscious consumerism, again, a universe of terms out there around sustainability. But that's just something everyone can relate to. What are the brands and companies that consumers and communities find best aligned with their values? And with that, it's no longer just about meeting investor profit or shareholder expectations, but also we're seeing that it's also meeting the needs and demands of communities, your suppliers, your vendors for procurement, but also communities are really at the forefront. ESG integrations as a mean to resilience. This through the pandemic has been key, and companies have pivoted to not only reactively respond to COVID and the challenges their employees are undergoing, the challenges the communities are undergoing, but they are working towards understanding going forward, their ESG strategies need to be resilient. So watch out for that term. I think we're just at the cusp of what resilience will take hold of in the ESG strategy over at companies. Human capital management, again, colleagues touched on this quite well. I think one thing to build on that is using human capital management strategy as a risk mitigator. When you think about the S, it's not only integrated into your lines of businesses, but how can it help you anticipate any upcoming risks as well? And then thirdly, another key trend of this year was definitely purpose. As a competitive advantage, we released our paper, Purpose During a Time of Crisis, that showed that companies that had a higher purpose or purpose statement outperformed their peers over 4 times in the capital markets. So we will make sure we circulate that paper following this session. And then I wanted to touch on transition versus transformational goals. A lot of companies coming out with these big commitments towards climate change, towards COVID response. And the traditional ones are one and done. You set a commitment for 2030 or 2050. What we'd like to see companies geared towards is transformational goals. What goals not only address one specific issue, but the material ones to your industry? And how can they transform your strategy across your lines of business? So it's not just a goal set at the top and released. It's really integrated throughout the rest of your lines of businesses as well. You also have sustainability bonds among corporate issuers at an all-time high. Moody's recently released some of the numbers, and overall green, social, and sustainability bonds, which are a mix of both green and social, reached $130 billion. And social, because of the amount of fundraising that has been raised in capital markets by corporate issuers, has reached 100 billion. So we're really seeing social bonds take a place alongside what has traditionally been green bond issuance in the space for corporates. next slide, please. We have some examples of some of these bonds. I won't touch on these too much because I'm already at time, but if we could go to the last slide for me, Jess, that would be great. Again, if anyone has any interest in doing a deep dive into sustainable finance, feel free to reach out to me after this session. We can set some time aside to really hone in on some of these key trends. One more slide, please. Just one more, yep. We're trying to get to the 2021 trends. Excellent. So again, I think going forward, investors are looking for progress, not perfection. When you're looking to measure what matters internally, know that investors don't expect you to resolve everything overnight. So they're just going to be making sure in your disclosures you have progress accounted for. ESG indices, these are being used increasingly by investors to benchmark the companies within portfolios and their investment decision-making process. They're getting more niche, more thematic. Also, we'll see some investment that typically goes to research and development be more ESG themed. And again, we'll have consolidation of providers and frameworks, as Emily touched upon, a lot of Pac-Man M&A going on there. And again, best-in-class companies really setting the tone for how their peers should be addressing ESG issues that are material to their sector. So with that, I'll pass it back over to Emily to close us out. And thanks again, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you so much, Alexa. It has been an unprecedented year and a really big year for both sustainability and ESG. And I know we are coming up on time really quickly. We started 5 minutes late, but we would like to get to some of the questions that you all have asked. So I'm just going to jump in. Team, these are going to be coming sort of rapid fire, so let's answer them quickly so we can move on to the next one. The first one, Alexa, is around sustainable finance. So somebody asked, they said their company is considering issuing a sustainable bond, thinking about a COVID type bond. Is this something that our team supports or something that we can work with them on or help connect them with any relevant resources?
Absolutely. So think of us as kind of your advisors, your intermediaries, helping you navigate the ecosystem of an issuance flow. There's a lot of players involved in issuing a green, or in this case, if you're thinking about issuing or allocating the funds to COVID relief, that would be a social bond. And we can help put you in contact with your second party opinion providers that would give you a rating of sorts for your bond to tell investors how social it really is. And we'll also make sure that your best interests are secured and that you move along the process to eventual issuance in a seamless manner.
Perfect, thank you. All right, next question. Nandika, I think this one's going to be for you. So how can CSR professionals prepare for the expected expansions of the role? I know you touched on the cross-functionality of how CSR teams are moving. Any specific advice for some of the CSR professionals on the line today?
Yeah, no, I do think that, that we are seeing a conflation at the moment where CSR and ESG are kind of merging, and we are seeing a trend where companies are beginning to take on the ESG framework as a part of their corporate responsibility goals role. And I think, some of this has obviously in the reporting sits with corporate responsibility. There has been a lot of that already happening. And I do think that the opportunity here lies by breaking down the silos between corporate responsibility and the investor relations and sustainability sides of the house in cases where they're not the same. And I do think that for corporate responsibility practitioners, this is the time, because I think CEOs and the C-suite are looking at you because you have the expertise, you have been working in the community, you are the employee engagement advocate, and they are kind of going to lean on you to be the ones that would bring to the table the policies and the practices that would best advance the company's corporate purpose and brand and reputation. So I think definitely reaching out across the aisle, as we will hope to do in 2021, is going to be the way forward for CSR practitioners.
Thank you. And I'll just quickly add to that, you know, from the CEO Investor Forum's perspective, we've also seen a rise in ESG committees and a move from, you know, a siloed CSR role to thinking about internally structuring sustainability and ESG in more of an enterprise ESG risk type of function. So that's something we've seen, and we're always happy to talk to folks about that. So I think last question before we close the session, David, this one's going to be coming towards you. So what does stakeholder capitalism mean for CEOs? Must they choose between their people and their communities and their investors, or is there another option there?
Almost forgot to unmute myself, but yes, you know, I think it comes down to really, it's just a different way of thinking about making decisions and making strategy. You know, traditionally, you know, the old economics thought is, you know, is this decision going to bring money to my shareholders, right? And now CEOs are realizing they can think more broadly. CEOs can think about all their constituents, that's people, communities, supply chain, and their shareholders. So it's not just the shareholders, it's all those other constituents as well. If you think about the DTE case, you know, an easy solution for them would have been during the financial crisis to lay off employees, you know, free up some capital for their company. But there was foresight there, you know, the CEO realized that, you know, if I can make a decision that helps my employees, you know, maybe long-term this will pay off for the company. And it did. You know, they saw that, you know, they were already an underperforming company. So, you know, granted, they did not have much to lose in that sense, but it was still a risk. You know, the easy choice would have been to lay off employees and you know, buff up the finances that way. But, you know, they decided to double down and really invest in their employees for the long term. That's a decision that not only benefited their shareholders over the coming years, but it also benefited their employees, their communities, and you know, all their stakeholders. And if you think about this, you know, CEOs are somewhat new to this. I mean, you know, this has been a rising trend that's been coming really, really quickly. And as Emily, I believe you mentioned in the beginning with the World Economic Forum and International Business Council's work, you know, we're speaking with these CEOs and about that issue. We had Brian Moynihan on a CEO roundtable, and, you know, he was giving a lot of business cases and CEOs were discussing a lot of different business cases about, you know, why this is something we need to care about. We need consistent metrics that everyone can adopt. But at the end, you know, we kind of looked at the camera and said, you know, but this is what we need to do because it's right for society. This is how we need to move forward. So seeing CEOs take that more empathetic stance, not just the business stance, you know, by the numbers is really a positive trend to see.
Absolutely. It's certainly hopeful to see. And I think we're all, you know, hopeful that 2021 brings more both social and environmental impact and a focus on change in those areas. So if there are no further questions, we are out of time. I'd just like to thank each of you for joining us this morning and for being patient with our technical difficulties. If you're able, please fill out this NPS score that has hopefully popped up on your screen. And we really look forward to working with you in the coming year. So thank you all.
Thank you, and a very happy new year. We're looking forward to 2021 being an amazing one for us.